Welcome back, everybody, for our last plenary session of the day. I hope you've been enjoying all the past sessions, and we realize it's been a long day on Zoom. So if you feel that you need to take a breather, maybe just do some stretches, take a deep breath in. Just before we start our last session by the excellent Linh on climate change activism in Asia. And just, a few reminders again for today. There were a bunch of brilliant panels. I could almost not decide which ones to go to that we just listened, but remember they are recorded and you can jump on. Two I'd like to notice because they were by our sponsors. There was basically session 33 by OSCE Interactive. It was quite timely, that session. They are silver sponsor for us, but they also spoke about the entire issue of Zoom fatigue and, the pros and cons of using the digital space. And it's very well worth listening into, because what struck me was about how sometimes just listening without watching often creates more empathy and concentration. So if you feel a bit tired, you could switch off the video and just listen in. Or take us for a walk. If you missed it, watch the recording, but also on Friday at 11:50 a.m., so it's tomorrow, OSCE will also demonstrate digital solutions to facilitate online connections with members and customers globally during a pandemic. So there's another opportunity to see how they're solving how they work in the digital space. Thank you, OSCE, for being a silver sponsor. Also a reminder that after the session, we'll hear from Veronica Durr, from our gold sponsor, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research, and I'll introduce her at the time. So it'll be right after our session with Linh. Again, as our face-to-face networking events unfortunately have been postponed given the current evolving COVID situation in Australia, we have the advantage now to use this great platform on Hoover and to engage online. And the added advantage is that now you can engage with people wherever they are in Australia, the Asia Pacific. And I think that's actually a brilliant way to reach out beyond our borders, which are currently locked. So please make use of these conference platforms. So this is it now for others. Of course, look at the program tomorrow on Friday. There's so many great sessions. And remember that if you missed a session, please, you can watch the recording. And again, if you have not looked at the brilliant, brilliant recording from the Pacific, the UQSPIA Cultural Night, it's an hour long. It's also on YouTube, and it's really worth watching. It's such great dancing. I'm still making my way through a break at a time. And I want to thank UQ and their, musicians and everybody else for bringing out these great cultural interludes in the breaks. All right. So now I don't want to take too much of Lin's time. I want to introduce the brilliant Linh, the Director of Leaders for Global Sustainability at the University of Melbourne. Linh is passionate about climate justice and social inequality. She's on a Wattle Fellowship at the University of Melbourne, a Bertha Fellow with Plan International Australia, and a board member of Climate Action Network Australia. She has worked the last decade. Now that makes me wonder whether she started as an infant, because she's one of those brilliant young youth activists that put our generation into shame. She's been working across advocacy and engagement, media and social enterprise. In the lead up to the Paris negotiations, she served as the publisher and editor-in-chief of The Verb. There she worked with a global team to localize and humanize stories from the UN climate change negotiation. And I think that's so important that we do that. And Linh was most recently Australian Pacific lead for the Climate Reality Project, Al Gore's climate change leadership program, and brought over 800 people together in Brisbane during Climate Week. And I have to say, I'm quite honored that I'm able to introduce her, and I'm quite honored that I'm able to MC and facilitate this session. And because, with that brilliance, I hope that some of it, shines over. So Linh, I'll give you the platform and space. So you have 20 minutes, and I'll send you tiny reminders. If you've got questions, pop them in the Q&A. We'll have time for that as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Suzanne. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining this keynote session on climate change activism in Asia. I know after spending a day on Zoom, no matter how exciting the conversations are, you start to look outside. So my name is Lynn Doe, and I'm joining you today from Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I just want to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So over the course of probably the last 15 years now, if you count when I started activism when I was in school, what I have focused my studies, activism, and also career and work on has always been on climate change and what are the different ways that change can happen, whether that's at a grassroots or institutional level. A lot of my life these days is spent in the middle of those two different ways of creating change now, which often, if I'm being honest, means that I feel a lot of whiplash. Now, the first day of this year's RDI conference and the student forum yesterday as well has been filled with, for me, some really interesting conversations around the importance of localization. What does it mean to work with young people in a really meaningful way? And how can research and practice better be bridged? I hope that some of you were able to join the roundtable this morning on feminist participatory action research for climate justice as well, which is something that I'm still discovering but really curious on. So given the wealth of what's already on offer in the program and the fact that most of you would be very familiar with exactly what the climate crisis is and what some of the implications of it might be, I'm not really going to be focusing the next 20 odd minutes on the problem or even some of the solutions in terms of economic policy or renewable energy deployment policy options. Instead, I've decided to get a little bit reflective with you all, so I appreciate you indulging me, where I'll be sharing with you some of my reflections and learnings from the work at the intersection of social movements and grassroots organisations alongside wide-reaching policy and how those two things can be balanced out. We're going to be looking not so much at the what or the why of climate, but a little bit about the how in terms of what perspective could we bring to our work and how, if we approached it in a slightly different way where we both valued grassroots voices but balanced that out with a bit of organisational capacity, it might change our approaches to work. So one of the questions I've been really interested in and have been able to explore with the Bertha Foundation and Plan International last year is, how do established organisations better support and enable grassroots movements? And when I think about established organisations, that could literally mean an INGO with country offices in a vast number of continents, but it could also just mean the local organisation that you happen to work for maybe is more of an established organisation than others within the community and society focused on similar issues. And I think this can really be in the context of supporting and enabling grassroots movements in Asia, Australia, or even within our own backyards. Sometimes for all of us who are here at the conference, I have personally found anyway, it can be easy when we get these professionalized roles and jobs in the nonprofit, social impact or development sectors to separate out a little bit of what we do at home with what we actually do in our jobs as well. And for me, I've been trying to get better at bridging those two things in my own life and work. And a simple question that I have to sort of ascertain if I feel as if I'm part of the grassroots or frontline community with any particular issue is, one, is that happening in my specific backyard? And often I find that a really useful way of just distinguishing what impact might this have on me. If I was working on this, do I actually have a choice, or is it so much in my sort of space that I really need to be confronting it? So that is maybe something useful for all of you as well. So I guess in addition to the roles that I'm currently in, which I'll touch upon very briefly, I'll draw upon my experience of leading Australia, the Australian Pacific Office for Climate Reality. And right now, as mentioned, I work with the University of Melbourne on a leadership development program. And then the other hat I mainly wear is supporting grassroots movements on climate change across Asia. Now, as someone who has only received a bachelor's degree, it's been really odd for me to be back in an environment where expertise is gained primarily through books and many years of research into a niche field that might be both sometimes highly abstracted or difficult to apply. It's also why I'm really glad to see the existence of RDI, this conference, and all of your participation here today, because by us actually getting together and talking about how does research connect in with practice and vice versa, I think we can start to bridge that gap. And I mentioned this because my university day-to-day environment is so different to the work I do with Active Asia. In the Active Asia setting, I'm often working with people who might not have any formal education or qualifications to prove what it is that they know. The only thing that they can point to, which I think is very valuable, but not always recognized in our formalized and Western or otherwise systems of education, is the lived experience that they have. In the same way that some of you with maybe humanities backgrounds, which is the background that I have, maybe have had to defend your research or your work against more quantitative forms of research. As a community of practitioners and researchers, we also, I think, need to grapple with the question of how will we better value, recognize, and integrate the wisdom that comes from lived experience as well. I'm not 100% sure if the chat function works. Maybe it does, but I'd love you to all take a moment and think about, when was the last time you spoke with someone who is a direct beneficiary or stakeholder in your work or research? So if people could just pop that into the chat when that would be excellent. Okay, so we've got some responses, which means that it does work. Excellent. Thank you for Rochelle and Rod for pumping it in. Excellent. So last week, this week, 2 weeks ago, all pretty recent. Feel free to be honest. If it was much longer than that, that's also okay. So I'll just let some of that come through in the chat. And it's actually really great to see, and maybe I'm speaking to people who are already ahead of the curve, that you, like Junior is saying, every day is when you speak to the people that you have to work with, or your project or research might be directly impacting. I think you're probably not going to be surprised to know that that is not often yet the case. And for me, a question that I have for all of you is, what would it take for you not to just to involve them in your work, but is it possible for you to place them at the center of what it is that you do? So as someone that supports grassroots movements, but isn't actually a member of some of these frontline communities myself, this is a question I'm constantly asking myself, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good my research or strategy or whatever is, if it doesn't actually directly benefit the communities that I'm trying to serve, and it doesn't meet a need or a want, importantly, that they're specifically looking for. So Active Asia, this organization I've mentioned a couple of times now, is an activist training provider that mainly works with climate and energy campaigners across the Asia region. And we're currently active in about 8 different countries and have an upcoming training later this month. So I'll share that link in a moment. And I joined their team in the middle of the pandemic to help them localize their training to different countries and contexts and balance out what it was that their funder was wanting from them, which at times wasn't always directly aligned with what it was that the attendees of the training really wanted. Before me, they had run 2 regional trainings across the sort of Asia region, more focused in Southeast Asia, but really quickly came to realize that you had to get much closer to the ground if you wanted to be working with frontline communities. One of the really big barriers there that some of you might have faced is there's a diversity of languages and cultures in this region, and so there's many limitations when you're just working in English. It also really forced me to take quite a lot of tutoring lessons in Vietnamese. It turns out I am only half fluent. I thought I was more fluent prior to this work. But really what this also spoke to was this tension between what the community most needs and wants alongside what a strategy is setting out to do, or sometimes why a funder might be interested. And this can be a little bit contradictory and not aligned. And I guess this is sort of where my hopefully 2 take-home messages for anyone working with communities impacted by injustice might be a little bit useful. And the first one is a really simple, adage is, if you don't ask the question, you'll never get the answer. So it's really great to hear that there's a bunch of people in this Zoom call that engage with their, and I'm calling them stakeholders and beneficiaries, but you can use a whole bunch of other words to actually reference and refer to the relationship you have with frontline communities. Frontline communities. And for me, sorry, I've just temporarily lost my notes. Anyway, I am back. And that's really great to see. And for me, I'm challenging myself personally to go a little bit more deeper than that. So once you ask the question of what's potentially needed, what's potentially wanted, you also obviously have to be very open and willing to listen to those responses as well, and being willing to potentially change the course of what your direction is on if the community that you're working with or the individual you're working with doesn't currently align. As I've said before, this isn't about diminishing the role of research or coming in with a strategy or a bit of just like a thought about how things could work, but I treat it as a game of improvisation where rather than being but, think of it as yes and. So yes and, what is the role or opinion of those with lived experiences? How can you include those people who have something directly often to gain or lose in any one specific setting? And in whatever work it is that you're engaging with, sometimes asking might actually feel like not quite enough. So is it possible to center them in the work? And I've mentioned that earlier on. So could you do something that is built on the principles of co-design and start working with these communities from day one, rather than just thinking of it as a, oh, I need to check this item off my list and I've talked to these individuals. So I guess to make this really practical, in the case of Activasia, this organisation receives pretty significant funding from an international philanthropic organisation. But when the organisation started up, it started up much, much more basic than that. And it was the result of a scoping study conducted by activists in the countries where we currently work, talking to the people who we might want to be working with. And I think we got really fortunate in that there was a funder who knew that they wanted to support something to do with climate and energy campaigners in Asia, but they weren't entirely sure how. And they were relatively open to listening as well, because some of the answers that came out of this sort of scoping study were a combination of confrontational and not 100% inherently aligned with what the funder might have traditionally wanted to fund. So through a series of these conversations, interviews, desktop research, seeing what other organizations were already doing to understand both the gaps and the analysis there, we settled on, and when I say we, this happened all before I joined the organization, but we settled on capacity building being the most appropriate answer. And through this process, it also became really clear, though, it wasn't enough for us to be initiating these conversations. We also really need to get clear on who we were asking and why we were asking them for their thoughts as well. Not all people or roles are universal truth speakers for any one country, culture, organization, or, perspective. If you were to ask me what I think about Australia's, policy on climate change, it would probably be very different if you asked someone whose day job was with a major fossil fuel company. But, you could both technically say that we're both Australians and we both work on climate change. And this is really true for other contexts as well. And sometimes we, as practitioners, I've certainly found in the past with my own work, can be really quick to generalize what grassroots means or what talking to the community means. And there's a bit of a cliche that if you're sitting on the ground, you're speaking to an activist. And that's not inherently true. And I think getting a bit smarter and more sophisticated about that can be really useful. So in the case of us, we started with talking to the funder of why would you potentially want to be giving hundreds of thousands of dollars into this work? What are your vested interests here? Where does this money come from? What do you expect in return? What would happen if this doesn't align with what the community actually wants or needs? You've invested for this initial step. How far are you willing to go and how much power are you willing to let go of? The second sort of not so much tier, so don't think of these as tiers. That's just how I've organized them in my head, because there's not a hierarchy of who's important to talk to. Everyone is, but for me, it's always about trying to center the people that are going to be the most affected at the very center rather than at the very fringes. They're already at the fringe of society for a bunch of reasons, so how can we bring them closer in? But following talking on with the funders, we started to talk a lot with campaigners and staff at organizations that either have a presence or receive funding from international sources. Some of these organizations are the ones that you would expect. Others were connected to us through this funder that still enables this project. And whilst a lot of these organizations have local staff, many of them are also very familiar with the international ways of working, if you will, in that nonprofit and advocacy sector. It might have been years since they were last directly leading a campaign where they had an individual stake themselves. And had we stopped our consultation and interviewing process there, we would have ended up with a very different program than what it is that we're working to deliver now. So to try to drill down a little bit further, and this is also something that you can do you need to go beyond what's the easily accessible organizations that might maybe have really great Google search results, and go to that next level of who are the organizers working at national or local organizations where they still might be paid for the work that they're doing, but their experience has predominantly been within said specific country or said specific region. Some of the ways of figuring out these organizations often is they might not have a website readily available for you to read in English. That was one of my often go-tos where I was like, yes, this is an organization not trying to reach me in Australia. It's definitely trying to reach other people in Vietnam, other people in Thailand. They might be very focused on national or state-based politics, whatever the jurisdictions that make sense there are. And they don't always reside in capital cities either. And lastly, where we really tried to get to was, who are these community leaders that are really often deeply embedded within a specific place or location where they're campaigning or working? And they're doing this potentially in a voluntary way, and often because they literally have no other choice, because it is happening within their backyards. And finding these individuals is hard because they might not always have huge presences on social media in the language that you speak. You won't be able to find them on LinkedIn necessarily or at conferences, but you know that you found them because a lot of other people will reference their work. Locating these individuals in a pandemic on Zoom was very hard, but that's a separate conversation. Now, I am conscious of time. Thank you, Suzanne. The second thing that I would just sort of mention is, through all of these conversations that we had, a very common thread that we found throughout was that whilst all of these communities were facing, varying levels of climate awareness, their adversary was often a government or corporation with a vested interest in the development of a new fossil fuel project, and that there would often be some sort of consequence to the local environment, such as the Mekong Delta, or it would also result in health impacts. All of that was really common, but it still didn't fully answer our questions of, well, how do we keep centering this work when sometimes these examples of what people were working on were quite disparate and disconnected. So some of these conversations became the catalyst for why Activasia should embark upon its own localization process of working not just within countries, but within specific regions and within specific communities as well. And through delivering capacity building, we realized that we used a lot of tools that some of you might be familiar with, such as power mapping, campaign strategy, community organizing, but it didn't always work with the communities that we were working with or trying to provide support for or trying to enable. And we had to adapt some of what was an in-person experience into something that was online, and given digital divide and access issues, again, that's a whole separate conversation that we may not have time for. And while some of the frameworks and methodologies that we introduced remain largely the same, one of the things that is different from all of the conversations that we had in that scoping and in all of the trainings we've run is, how does power get conceptualized? So at the most macro level, almost every country in Asia has a different system of government, and as a result has a different role for civil society organizations and different sort of legality around what grassroots groups might go about doing. And sometimes this is a really public form of power. It's really visible and you can sort of identify it. But then there's also invisible forms of power and what just gets accepted. And this could be everything from, what is the role of women in society or the family or a campaign? What's the impact of religious beliefs or traditions or superstitions in doing some of this sort of work? And how can campaigning potentially really push up against this? And it became important for us as an organisation in trying to centre grassroots movements to recognise that, yes, cultural relativity is very important in a land for self-determination, but it also needs to still be done in a way that confronts and changes existing structures and systems of power. Now, this is still very much an ongoing process. I'm very conscious that I'm at time though, so I'm gonna, I think, wrap up with just saying that there's no one perfect answer to this, and just because I got given this lovely afternoon slot definitely doesn't mean that I have all of the answers and solutions either, and would be really open to continuing these conversations with people who are interested in centering and really focusing their work on how they could be enabling grassroots movements, whether on climate or other issues. I think there's a lot of similar learnings, but I'm going to hand over to Suzanne now.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. I just want to pull some things out of it. You know, I think you said you don't have the answers, but there's so many of the best practice that you've reminded us asking questions, but also listening and listening to hear, which is an Indigenous concept that I've learned as well. Don't make assumptions. Don't make assumptions, especially about who's the grassroots, who's the local, who has power, who doesn't. Don't you go with the usual suspects, go with the hard to reach, understand that their power base is everywhere and not just at the global scale or national scales. And yeah, making sure that when you ask questions that you be very clear why you're asking people questions, maybe also ask for their time. So much to take away from and so much brilliant of your work. Now, I haven't seen questions yet pop up, except there was one that asked for the provision of Active Asia, the website. They couldn't find
that.
They couldn't find us. If you could pop that in, maybe, or if later somebody, maybe pop it in as an answer. So I really, there was just so much to take in. I actually woke up. So, thank you, Lynn, for putting it. So, Ben, I hope you can see the Active Asia, probably because it is spelled with a K.
Yes, correct.
No, I think that's how we make assumptions, right? We grab our nose, we make assumptions. So please ask questions. Otherwise, I'll take the MC privilege and will ask Lynn myself a question. Is there anybody here with a question? We have about 2 minutes to go in this panel. I wonder if people are just still digesting. Lynn, for me, I guess I wanted to see, it's just amazing the work you've done, right? And the amazing work you continue to do, and particularly at your age. The energy is just brilliant. Is there any main issue, encouragement you would give to young people in that space? Because power, obviously, as you say, is not just gendered, it's cultural, but it's also very much generational. And I always see that when I go to the school strikes, how angry some of the younger generation is at my generation, basically, and rightfully so.
Yes. So I think it sort of goes hand in hand with my favorite piece of advice is always just start. Yes, you'll definitely make mistakes along the way. And I think the more experienced you become, the more you realize how big the mistakes you've made are. And there's definitely something that comes with starting out where you have just a little bit of extra confidence and a little bit of being able to not, be super aware of all of the faults that is really useful. And then the other is power is this really interesting thing. And we often talk about the demographics in society that might not necessarily have power. I also like to think of power as this abstract thing that might be in a room. And yes, when you walk into it, maybe immediately some of it goes to particular types of people that historically are more, I guess, valued in terms of their opinion. But the power is theirs for the taking. It's yours to take, and it's yours to figure out, well, if that power exists and you don't have access to it, how could you build your skills or power so that you could gain access to it? So I think there's a lot of different ways that young people in particular can really buck the trend of being that person in the room that might be a bit tokenistic.
What a brilliant question, Lynn. So I know it's time actually, but I want to throw the last question actually to the speaker that will go after you, from Veronica Durr from ACR. Researchers are often accused of bias if they participate in activism. How would you encourage people to navigate these tensions? Maybe we can use as a last question, and that's a good segue into the next speaker as well.
Perfect. Excellent. I think this is a great question. And I just listened to something around academic freedom of speech and can you criticize people still, and advised on a colleague that I just recruited into the team if they could still participate in activism. At the end of the day, we're whole people. I think it's really hard to do this work and not feel something personally yourself and want it to be reflected in your values of how you show up in a community, how you show up in solidarity with different communities or on different issues. And I think in the process of what you would do if it was a business transaction where you would declare possible conflicts of interest, I think you can go about doing something really similar when you're embarking upon research or embarking upon activism. I think the more people are actually vocal about how they are more than just what they happen to be working on, the more it becomes accepted that, yes, of course, Suzanne, who researches policy X, also has a vested interest in it, and that's how she also spends some of her weekend time as well. I think the more we normalize that as well, the more it will become less stigmatized, essentially.
Brilliant answers, Lynn. There's actually another question that popped up, and maybe you can answer that because of time, I want to hand over to Veronica now. So that is the question from Tamara. If you can see that in the chat function, she's wondering about that. Hopefully that would be one way to answer that question. Well, let's just all join in to thank, I was like trying to figure out how to make the heart for Lynn, the energy that he brought at the end of such a long day and the great work that you're doing. And I'm quite feel honored and privileged that I was able to MC with you. Thank you, Lynn. And I hope that our path will cross many, many times in the future. So now, before everybody please stay, again, we have now that Veronica Durr, who just asked the question, last question to Lindo that I read out. She's the research program manager for climate change with ACR. So obviously what Lynn is doing is close to her heart. She also represents one of our, the gold sponsor, the Australian Centre for International Agricultural Research. So, and all of our sponsors get a bit space. So I want to hand over to Veronica and also remind you that there was a session that Veronica was in just before this session, and that was session number 36. So if you missed it, I only was able to see part of it. It is recorded, so you can indeed listen into it. So please, Veronica, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, and thank you to Lynn. It's been a tremendous first day of the conference, and what a plenary to cap it off. I have the privilege of not taking up very much of your time today, everyone, but actually to do some reflection on the whole day of the conference. And I think that's a really nice way to try to end a day and wrap it all up, because there's been so much inspiring work talked about. And when I reflect on Lynn's talk and Lynn's experience, right? So it's very much about recognizing that if we're going to forge pathways through disruption, we actually need to be a little bit disruptive ourselves. And when I look at the conference program as a whole, what I actually see is a whole bunch of ways in which we're looking to be disruptive. So I just have a couple of slides because I always think a visual aid helps. So I'm just going to share a couple of things with you as part of these reflections. So when I look at the program as a whole, I see a bunch of ways in which we're pushing and we're accelerating towards a future that's quite different than the one we have today, that is quite disruptive. A future that really is locally led, entrepreneurial, decolonized, transformative, because we're looking to change the fundamental systems that we've built that we know aren't working to satisfy the values that we know we have, and a really much more deeply collaborative future. Those are the themes that I see kind of woven through the workshops and the presentations and everything today and going forward tomorrow. And when I reflect on that, that's what, that's what's coming our way, surely, I hope. Then what I also reflect on as a research leader, as part of an organization that commissions research that's trying to give us a better future, there's a degree to which research needs to approach this differently. So we need to be ready to be active participants. We need to be ready to bring our whole selves, as Lynn says. We need to join the research and the action and development a little bit more tightly. And so that's kind of what I wanted to reflect upon is we're seeing these key themes about the future. And what does that mean for how the way we do research needs to change? And so I've been reflecting on the changing nature of research. And if you actually search the internet for images of researchers, you will invariably get a whole ton of people in lab coats. And then you will get a bunch of other images of people alone, clearly thinking, staring at a computer screen. And let's face it, we do a fair bit of that. But that whole image of a researcher being someone who just observes the world and records something about it, but isn't part of it, is very much changing. And I'm very happy to say that, for some time now, research in development has had a very different model, or research for development, I should say, has had a very different model. And certainly, you know, the type of research that ACR supports has been much more about, you know, Australian researchers really engaging in country with colleagues. But there's also a degree to which research for development has still been a little bit, you know, the Australian expert is the expert, and they're giving their knowledge to others who desperately need it and want it. So you have them being almost the lecturer, with the in-country partners being the listeners. And I think when you reflect on the future that we're headed towards, what we're really looking for and building towards in terms of how research itself needs to change is a model that's much more research in development. And I represent that with an image like this, where you've got a much more blended sense, where researchers are truly embedded with the people that they're trying to assist, that it's a mixture of scientific knowledge with local knowledge, and it becomes about the process of how you bring those together to co-create solutions that you both own, and you both are kind of vested in trying to support and bring forward. And I think it's actually a very different model of doing research. And it's, as much as I've heard many inspiring stories of people doing that type of work across the conference today, it's still not necessarily the dominant way of engaging in research, maybe particularly agricultural research and development. So I think it's really important to reflect on this. And if we're moving towards a model of research in development, where researchers are genuinely participating in creating this future, well, then a future that's locally led involves researchers who are really supporting and empowering others, including the activists, including the disruptors, including the local leaders. If the future is entrepreneurial, then researchers really need to be working with the private sector, but especially those small and medium enterprises that are really an important part of the countries that we partner with. If the future is decolonized, then research needs to look at how it shares and shifts power to leadership in the countries that we're working in. If the future is transformative, then research needs to be bringing systems science to the table, because it's those big long-term goals like gender and disability equity, sustainability, resilience that require a whole systems approach. And if the future's more deeply collaborative, then researchers need to be really entering into deep partnerships that bridge multiple disciplines, and not only research disciplines, that are engaged in co-production with farmers, with governments. In other words, transdisciplinarity that recognizes that there are other disciplines, non-science disciplines out there that we need to deeply collaborate with. So I'm really proud of the organization I work for. ACR, you may not realize it, but ACR is really embracing this future of research. You know, you traditionally think of agricultural research and you imagine we're all doing, you know, really specific crop genetics experiments. And of course we do some of that sort of stuff. But much more, we're interested in building really multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary projects. We're interested in transdisciplinarity. We're actually looking at restructuring all of our contracts and procurement models, so that we can start to actually have our project leaders and our commissioned organizations be organizations in the countries that we work with, so that we're shifting toward the Australian role being a supporting one rather than a leading one. And you know, I could go on. There's all kinds of things that we're doing, but I think it really is about these kind of inspiring trends that we've heard about today. But that we need to really recognize, and we need to seize the opportunity to change how research is done, to really drive to this sort of future that we've been talking about. And so as you go home to your families, unfortunately, we're not going to networking events, but as you go home to your families, as you talk with your colleagues over the coming days, I would encourage you to reflect on the whole conference program, but really think about, what do you think the future of research really looks like? And how are you contributing to making that future a reality so that we can support a future that's locally led, entrepreneurial, decolonized, transformative, and deeply collaborative. Thanks to everyone for a fantastic first day of the conference. And I'll hand back to you, Suzanne, to close us out today.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Veronica. And again, like so much, in terms of like coming into what Lynn was saying, emphasizing it, show that ACR is walking the talk and changing how research is done. I've forgotten to start my video. I love the idea that if you want to be changed, we have to disrupt ourselves and what we do. And, that's a very great message. And I think that slide you had about how we should do research differently, perhaps you can share that even in the community for us to see. There was actually a quick question that maybe I'm going to throw to you. Lynn is actually answering right now, but maybe you can also answer it as well, which is, how can we ensure that traditional knowledge isn't co-opted by the global north and colonized? It's a very valid question. Again, I'm not so sure whether we have now the space here to answer it, but maybe you can type that answer into the chat because it's true. We all talk about decolonizing and we talk about local knowledges, but it could be co-opted in that sense as well. As I know that I've already seen people dropping off. So I think it is time to maybe just, again, thank you so much. What a brilliant last session for waking up, for shaking up, for making us think. Thank you for Veronica as well to remind everybody to reflect on the conference program for today, but also for the great sessions that we have tomorrow. While we don't have face-to-face networking events, there's so many now meetups and virtual networking events that we could engage with and perhaps talk to people that we otherwise wouldn't have talked to. So we really should make that happen. So again, take some time as you kick back tonight to reflect for today. Take some time to listen, to reflect on what Lynn and Veronica have just shared. Take some time to think about what sessions you want to be with tomorrow. I have got a full program tomorrow. And again, I want to thank the organizers here, my colleagues from the University of Queensland, particularly big shout out to Thor, who has been brilliant. My colleagues at the Research for Development Impact Network that have helped coordinate this conference. Big shout out to Whitney, but also Ilona. And again, to my fellow colleagues at the conference committee that you will be meeting as chairs or MCs tomorrow. So thank you all for a brilliant, brilliant first day. And thank you again to our sponsors that have made this conference happening. And thank you all for joining in. So in that way, I'm trying to keep time and make sure I'm not losing people. I can see participants dropping off. Have a great evening and stay engaged, stay reflective. Thank you again, Lynn and Veronica.